Last lesson, we talked about how Japan became a fully feudal society ruled by local dynamos instead of a centralized power. Between 1573 and 1600, two powerful and ambitious men attempted to lead Japan as shoguns themselves or to manipulate the office for their own needs. Neither of these men ultimately became shogun, but each did become extremely powerful in his own right. This time marks the transition between the end of the Ashikawa era and the beginning of the golden age of Japan feudalism, the Tokugawa. Oda Nobunaga was a samurai who attacked the city of Kyoto and established control over it, then went on to take over other regions. He was a brutal leader who treated the people he conquered harshly. Ultimately, he was murdered by his generals. After his death, General Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose to power. Toyotomi tried to unify Japan, and by 1590 he had conquered the remaining provinces and established himself as ruler of the entire country. Next, he attempted to take over China. He began by invading Korea, but the Ming dynasty sent troops to help the Koreans beat back the Japanese. Although he tried again later, he never succeeded in his attempts to conquer Korea and China. Before his death, Toyotomi arranged for a council to govern until his son came of age. After Toyotomi died, one of the regents, Tokugawa Leyasu, killed his son, defeated a coalition of dynamos, and assumed full power. During Toyotomi's reign, Europeans came into contact with Japan for the first time when Portuguese sailors were shipwrecked on the Japanese coast. Over time, the Portuguese traded goods and weapons with the Japanese. In addition, the Portuguese also introduced Christianity to Japan. Jesuit missionaries met with some success in converting the Japanese to Christianity, but the country remained predominantly Buddhist and Shinto. The few Japanese the Jesuits did manage to convert later suffered persecution and even death before Japanese Christianity was driven underground during the Tokugawa Shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who seized power after the death of Toyotomi, was the dynamo of a large territory around the city of Edo, present-day Tokyo. After solidifying his control, he was proclaimed shogun by the emperor, an act which led to centuries of rule by the Tokugawa family. Ieyasu tried to secure Tokugawa rule and avoid problems of succession by resigning as shogun in 1605 and having his son Hidetada named as his successor, although Ieyasu kept most of the real power for himself. These actions established a precedent, and in the same way that his father had, Hidetada resigned the position of shogun while still alive, so that his grown son could assume the position. Eliminating problems of succession helped strengthen the claim to leadership for the Tokugawa family. Ieyasu had reorganized the dynamos and required pledges of allegiance from the dynamos in outlying areas. Eventually, the Tokugawa and their allies brought most of the estates under their control, bringing a degree of political unity to Japan. The Tokugawa government relied on the feudal system and appointed local daimyo to help administer the provinces outside the capital of Edo. To further encourage loyalty and ties to the central government, the daimyos were expected to spend time both in the court at Edo as well as their own province. The Tokugawa also placed a premium on keeping order and control. It took a number of steps to strengthen its control and to decrease both domestic and foreign threats to their power. For example, the Tokugawa outlawed guns in order to protect its rule and to preserve order, and also established both a public and secret police in order to monitor events in the provinces and report any disloyal activities that took place. In addition, the government ultimately closed Japan to foreign influence, which it had increasingly come to see as a danger. The Tokugawa Shogunate established a long period of peace throughout Japan while consolidating its own power. The Tokugawa's emphasis on order resulted in a well developed class system centered around professions. Warrior administrators stood at the top, along with hereditary elites. Because the Tokugawa regarded them as valuable producers, peasants made up the second tier. Craftsmen and artisans formed the third tier, since the Tokugawa saw their work as less critical than that of the peasants. The prevailing attitude at the time was that merchants did not produce anything for society, they merely handled what others had produced, and therefore stood outside the traditional class system. This view reflected the continuing influence of Chinese Confucian principles in order and structure. During the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai began to transcend their lower class, mercenary origins, and develop themselves to the Bushido Code, in particular, its emphasis on self control. Since the Tokugawa government had taken the weapons out of the hands of the people of Japan, the military role of the samurai grew. Because the Tokugawa era was a time of relative peace and order, less need existed for the military leadership of the samurai. Consequently, many of them shifted into government and administrative roles. Catholic missionaries, including groups like the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, Catholics, took steps to introduce Christianity in Japan. While the shoguns had initially thought that the missionaries might bring valuable information with them, as well as facilitate trade, they later came to see the missionaries, and ultimately all foreigners, as a threat. Catholic missionaries had hoped to convert the elites, but had little success in doing so. The missionaries then turned their attention to the peasants and those in the countryside, where they fared much better in gaining converts. In 1606, the shogunate issued legislation that aimed to force people to abandon the Christian faith. An uprising, known as the Shimabara Rebellion, had occurred earlier in the southern and eastern areas of Japan, where most of the country's Christian converts lived. The shogun believed that the revolt had occurred because of the influence of Christianity. The new laws began a period of persecution. Foreign missionaries were killed or exiled, and Japanese Christians were punished or executed if they did not recant. The Shimabara rebellion convinced Tokugawa leaders to take steps in order to limit the influence of Europeans. They limited public access to foreign literature and books, a decision that would prevent many European scientific and technological advances from reaching Japan. The Tokugawa also forbade foreigners from coming to Japan, made it a capital crime for Japanese citizens to leave the country, and strictly limited trade. The Japanese did not reject everything foreign. While they sought to isolate themselves from the world, they did allow very limited trade with the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Koreans. Some dynamos far removed from Edo ignored the ban and continued trading with the outside world. In doing so, they accumulated a great deal of wealth and increased their status and power in Japan. Japan would remain isolated from the rest of the world for more than 200 years. The closing did not cause Japan to collapse economically. The country did maintain limited and strictly controlled trade with the Koreans, Dutch, and Chinese. In addition, interregional trade within Japan grew rapidly, and different regional dynamos encouraged production of goods that could be traded throughout the country. Economic growth resulted in the abandonment of the barter system and the implementation of a money system. Production in the agricultural sector, however, did not grow in the same way that regional trade did, as it remained weak. Despite advances in irrigation and other farming techniques, crop yields remained low, a troublesome development for dynamos and samurai, who depended on taxes collected on agricultural production. Although some samurai obtained positions in government, many found that their need for warriors had dropped. In order to survive, many samurai turned to merchants to borrow money. The position of the samurai gradually weakened and worsened, and some took more and more common positions, tilling land alongside peasants or becoming rice merchants. In addition to tilling the land, the samurai serving as rice merchants accumulated debt at a rapid rate, further weakening their position, status in society. As the role of the military declined, the samurai code of honor seemed to lose its relevance, as seen in the case of the 47 Ronin. Ronin were samurai who had lost their masters. In this incident, the shogun condemned a group of samurai for avenging the death of their lord, instructing them to commit suicide as a punishment for their revenge. By this time, the shogun was more interested in preserving a centralized order rather than allowing for individual samurai to pursue justice according to their own code of ethics. In spite of its isolation, Tokugawa Japan had a vibrant cultural and artistic life. The lavish culture of in Edo was known as the Genroku. Kabuki was a popular form of theater involving rich costumes and interaction with the audience. Women were not allowed to act in plays, so men played female roles as well. Lifelike puppet plays, known as bunkaraku, were also frequently staged. Haiku, poems made up of 3 lines and 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, and 5 syllables in the third line, also became popular during this period. Here's an example of a haiku. Against the bright sky, stones glow where strong arms place them, to say, remember. The city of Edo was built almost entirely of wood, except for the shogun's fortifications. Not surprisingly, it burned down several times and had to be rebuilt. The section of Edo that contained arts and culture, as well as other questionable pursuits, became known as the floating world. During the Ashikawa shogunate, Japanese painters adapted a style of landscape painting developed in Song, China, providing a deeper, more abstract focus on nature. Japanese painting flourished under the patronage of wealthy merchants in cities like Edo. The Japanese made woodblock printing a fine art. Artists would create a series of wood blocks based on a painting, then would apply a different color of paint to each block, and then print them on top of one another. Woodblock prints became very popular and widespread, since multiple copies could be easily made. An increased literacy rate helped fuel an interest in literature. Many of the works written during the time were fairly serious, involving several important histories that stressed the value of Japanese identity. That's the end of this long video. where we talk about the Tokugawa culture, the rise of the arts, the floating world. Remember, there is questions on Google Form to answer.